Welcome to the Polgar Chess University. Today I'd like to respond to requests that I received from many of you asking me how come I'm not talking much about openings. Well, my response to that is that I don't believe that up to an expert or master level, openings are terribly important. Most games on a club level or non-professional level are decided by tactics or endgames or strategical maneuvers. It's rare that the opening would be the decisive factor on determining who wins the game. Yes, once in a while there are opening traps that one falls into, but I would say at least 90% of the games are not decided in the early stages of the game. And time to time I will show you some opening traps that you should avoid or try to catch your opponent on. But I do believe very strongly that until you reach at least a 2000 level in rating, the main thing you need to focus on is your calculation skills, being able to outcalculate your opponent or not to fall into your opponent's tactical traps, trying to understand strategy better as of making plans, and of course understanding what your opponent's plans may be, and of course, last but not least, understanding endgames better and knowing the most important theoretical endgame positions. However, because of the request of a number of you, I'd like to bring up a subject, an opening idea that's relatively doesn't require that much concrete knowledge and is very practical for that purpose. And namely, that is the King's Indian attack. It's one of a number of opening choices for white when you want to avoid lengthy opening variations. Let's get started with the first game I'd like to share with you. Here we go. The game I'll illustrate this with is a famous game of Bobby Fischer's against Myanmar Rusin from the Seuss Interzonal Tournament in 1967. The King's Indian attack could be started, in fact most often it's being started by playing knight to f3, followed by fianchettoing the bishop on the king's side and castling. Typically, let's say d5, g3, knight to f6, bishop g2. And here black can choose from a number of different setups. Could fianchetto his own bishop by playing g6, could play e6, could play c5, good number of choices. For example, c5, a common response, trying to control the center. White castles and black develops, and white would have a setup with playing d3. Now if you look at this position, you'll notice that this is a reversed King's Indian defense, and it is called the King's Indian attack. White's plan is to play knight d2 and then e4, similarly to the King's Indian defense. As you will see in our sample game, that this setup has a lot of teeth to it. Let's go back and see how in a totally different move order it is also possible to achieve this same setup. The advantage of playing the King's Indian attack is that it's very universal, and regardless what black's setup is, it's very well playable. Of course, it works better against certain setups like the one we'll see, but nevertheless it's well playable against any setup of blacks. So let's see the actual game. Bobby Fischer was white. Game e4, the response was the French defense. Here the most common and the most ambitious move is to play d4, occupy the center, also with a second pawn. However, in this game, Fischer chose a different plan by playing d3. And as you'll see, very soon the game transposes to a King's Indian attack setup. Now it's important to play knight e2, as otherwise, if white does not play that, black would get the opportunity to trade pawns on e4 and then trade queens on d1. It would be unwise for white to allow that, because after that, white would lose the right to castle if the king needs to recapture on d1. White continued with knight d2, and black responds with knight f6. And g3, c5, bishop g2, knight develops on both sides, bishop e7. Now we can see a very similar setup as I demonstrated at first when the game starts with knight f3. So here the game started with a king pawn move to e4, and then to black's French defense response. Nevertheless, the game transposed to this opening. The game could also transpose to such a position or similar if black would have responded by playing the Sicilian defense, white kind of playing similar moves as did in this game. White castled, and so did black. And now I'd like to give you some ideas how typically this opening is being played. If black chooses this particular setup, which is a very natural one, trying to have as much control of the center as possible and developing the black bishop to e7, then the plan is to close the position in the center and quickly develop a kingside attack. Black, of course, cannot move towards the center with the knight, but needs to move backwards. Namely, the best choice is to move to d7, attacking the white pawn on e5 a second time, and white needs to protect the pawn, and the best way to do that is with the rook going to e1. If right now black would choose to attack that pawn a third time, white could conveniently defend it with a queen move to e2. In the game, black continued immediately by playing b5. Typically, in this variation, white tries to develop a quick attack on the king's side against black's king, while black, on the other hand, is trying to open files on the queen's side to get counterplay there. However, typically, an attack against the king is more dangerous than an attack on the other side of the board, where the target would be to open a file and maybe win some pawns or material. Because oftentimes, like as you'll see in this game, white can kind of burn all the bridges on the queen side of the board as long as the attack on the king side succeeds. So let's see how the game continues. White immediately proceeded with a very typical plan, improving the queen knight's position in trying to get it to the king's side to help the attack. Knight f1, and black played b4, and another very typical move that you may want to remember is playing h4. This has a number of purposes. On one hand, to clear the h2 square for a knight, and then the knight may go to g4 in many variations. Another plan is to advance simply the pawn to h5 and then h6, or if black of course plays h6 himself, that is provoking a weakness, and oftentimes white is able to sacrifice on h6 the bishop or the knight after it arrives to g4. And a third plan that h4 can help with is to prepare a bishop exchange with bishop to g5. The game continued by black playing a5, and white played bishop to f4, developing the last minor piece, and came a4. And this is an interesting moment in the game. Black is planning to play a3 to open the a file or force white to push the b pawn through but that would weaken the c3 square, and Bobby Fischer was not comfortable with allowing that. He had an interesting comment about this position on how to deal with the challenges of such a complex game. He said the most important thing basically about chess is knowing when to punch and how to duck. Well, he certainly proved it in this game. He knew how to do it right. He played a3, preventing Black's move of advancing the pawn, and came an exchange of pawns on a3. And at this moment, Black's best choice was to develop the last undeveloped minor piece, namely the Black bishop from c8 to a6. Instead, in the actual game, Black played knight a5, which is not the greatest move. As we can see, the knight has no real active move from a5, and therefore it's a mistake. And in this moment, there was an interesting move. White played knight from f1 to e3. Typically, in this opening, the knight rather goes through h2. But in this case, I believe Fischer was trying to tempt his opponent to play d4 now or sometime soon, and with that weakening the e4 square as well as the c4 square. Another plan White could have considered was, of course, to try to advance the h-pawn right away. Black responded by playing bishop to a6, and here came another interesting but somewhat typical move for this opening, bishop to h3. The purpose of this move is to prevent Black's f-pawn moving ahead, for example, to f5. Now, if Black would still do that, White would do en passant, and the e6 pawn would be already targeted. Black responded by playing d4, attacking the white knight, and here came a somewhat surprising move with the knight retreating to f1. Typically, you'd think that the knight wants to go to g4 in this position. However, perhaps Fischer felt that the knight will be in the way of the queen on d1. He had different plans, and therefore retreated the knight back to f1. And the knight very soon may appear through d2 and e4 to aid the attack. Black played knight to b6, trying to activate his own knight through d5 and c3. And White finally moves ahead and starts the attack by playing knight g5. Black's next move was another inaccurate move. It was better to play h6, although White's chances looked pretty good then too. The plan would be to retreat the knight to e4, and for example, if Black advances with his plan on the queen side, White would go all out and attack, kind of ignore a little bit Black's counterplay here, and now play knight to f6 check. Black better takes, because if the Black king moves to the corner, then the white bishop would sacrifice on h6. After pawn captures knight, now bishop would capture on e6, pawn captures back, and bishop captures h6. Now there is a serious checkmate threat with queen g6 or queen g4 coming up, and then queen g7, depending on what Black plays. If Black tries to defend that by playing rook f7, the check would still come from g6, and after king h8, queen captures rook would give White again a winning position and material advantage. Let's go back for a moment to the game. After knight g5, Black played knight d5, going after White's bishop on f4, and White simply retreated the bishop to d2. Again, the threat is to get the queen out there to h5. It's quite clear that Black's counterplay is a bit too slow. Black traded the bishop for the knight, and the bishop captured back. It's important to mention that in similar situations, it's definitely worth considering also to recapture with the h-pawn. To mention a typical plan, white would try to get the king and the knight out of the way, and then play rook h1, queen h5, and develop an attack on the h-file. Maybe in this particular case that's a bit too slow, but it's important to understand the correct middle game ideas so you can adjust your particular moves to the needs of the concrete position. In this game, white captured with the bishop, came queen d7, and queen h5. Now white's plan is, in the next couple of moves, to retreat the bishop from h3 to g2, then move it to h4 to provoke another weakness in black's position. Black played rook f to c8 and came knight d2, improving the position of the knight first. Now the knight aims to go to e4 and then most likely to f6 or perhaps to d6 in some other cases. After knight d2, black responded by playing knight to c3. And now, ready for action, came bishop to f6, sacrificing the bishop. If black indeed would capture that, the pawn would take back, and if the king tries to run, knight f3, rook g8, and knight e5. And black would be in major trouble after the white knight appears on f7. Black did not capture the bishop, but played queen e8, getting ready to meet queen g5 with queen f8. But white plays differently. Fischer played in this position knight to e4. This threatens on one hand to play knight d6, and it also offers an exchange of the knights. Of course, if black would do the trade on e4 right now, the white rook would appear on that same square, and then the rook would appear on the king's side with rook g4, as we shall see very soon. The knight also threatens right now to go to g5, aiding the queen in the attack. Black responded by playing g6. If queen h6 now, queen f8, and black is holding his own. Much better to move with the queen to g5 for now. This is still a rather complicated position, although favoring white. I'm not gonna spend too much time in getting on the details on each variation, how white is coming up ahead, but I'll just show you the main, most important lines and the game itself, of course. Rook captured back on e4, and black played c4, and now the real race starts. But as I mentioned earlier, an attack on the king is always a lot more important than attacks on strategical targets. And now, finally, h5. And black captured on d3, and white ignores, as I mentioned, burns all bridges and goes for the kill. If now black captures on c2, white would be ready to open the h-file. Of course, the h-pawn cannot recapture because of checkmate on h8, and after f takes back, rook captures on h7. Very nice. If king captures back, checkmate comes in 3 moves. Check, king g8, queen h8, king f7, and queen g7. Black responded by rook a7, and now black's idea is that if pawn captures, the f-pawn captures back, and the rook on the 7th rank protects itself on h7. But white has a trickier idea by playing bishop g2, Black captures on c2. And now Queen h6. A very brilliant idea, as you'll see in just a second. Threatening to checkmate on g7. And after Queen f8 is checkmate in 3 moves. Sit back and try to figure it out on your own before you go further and look at the correct solution here. And that correct solution is queen takes pawn, a beautiful queen sacrifice. King takes, pawn takes with a double check. If the king goes back to g8, the checkmate arrives on h8. Or if the king captures the pawn instead, then the bishop moves to e4, checkmate again. A brilliant game, one of my all-time favorites of Bobby Fischer's games. So going back to the question of the opening, this gives you an idea on the plans, on the ideas that White would use in the King's Indian attack against the French/Sicilian setup that Black may choose. Of course, it's not the only setup, but it's actually a very common one. I promise I'll come back in future lessons with ideas in the King's Indian attack. So if you choose to, you can develop an opening choice how to play with White. And one of the great advantages of it is that it avoids those forced long variations that you could see in many of the other openings, such as the Sicilian or the Ruy Lopez or others. And finally, let me share with you the jewel of the week. Here we go. In this endgame position, Black is 1 pawn ahead at the moment. And White's supposed to win. I suggest you take your time, give yourself 5-10 minutes, and see if you can find out the correct solution before you go further. The natural move of capturing the pawn on a6 would be a big mistake because it would allow a discovery check with bishop b2. And then when the White king moves out of the check, the White rook would fall and Black would win the game. So how should White continue? The move is king b3, attacking Black's bishop on a3. If the bishop would move away, the Black rook would be hanging. But Black has a trick up his sleeve, namely playing rook b2 check. If the White king now goes back to where it came from, to c3, so would the Black rook, and that would be a repetition of moves and would not make progress for White. But what happens if the White king captures the Black bishop? Well, then the idea is to give a check, which is a skewer. White has only one legal move, moving to b3, and wow, there goes the rook. Rook takes a5. So this did not work for White, did it? Well, you'd be surprised, it did. Even though Black is the one who won material, it is White who is winning the game, as long as White finds the correct move right now, which is moving the knight back to c3. And amazingly, Black is in zugzwang, the Black king has no moves, and the Black rook only has moves that would put the rook into an attack. After rook b5, naturally, White would capture the rook with a knight, not with a pawn, because White needs to maintain at least one pawn to win the game. However, after knight takes b5, White wins easily. After pawn takes, the White pawn will promote, while the Black pawn is hauled off. Well, hope you enjoyed this beautiful endgame and gained some ideas on how to play the King's Indian attack. Thank you for listening, and so long until next week.